In this video, I want to talk a little bit about composing introductions. And we're going to look at some principles for creating introductions, composing introductions, and then we'll look at some examples of those from articles that students have submitted. So first of all, if we think about the introduction of the paper, if we compare the paper to a story or a drama, at the beginning of a drama or story, you first have to set the stage. You give the setting, you describe the characters and where and when they are. So we'll do something similar in the paper in that we need to give the background information, what has come before this paper, what other studies have been done, what other work has been done in this field. We also need to explain to the reader why this is important. Why should they care about this subject? The next three slides we're going to look at are from the George Mason University Writing Center, and they laid out some good principles on the rhetorical moves that you would go through in creating an introduction to your paper. So let's look at some of those. Very quickly, you need to establish why this paper is important. Another area is to show why it's problematic. Where is the gap? Is there a gap in the knowledge, or is there some problem that needs to be solved? So if there's no problem, if there's nothing to be done, then we really don't need to do the study. And then finally, we need to look at why is this study relevant to this area of research. As with a story, you have to figure out what the conflict is. So the author needs to introduce the conflict in the story. Otherwise, there really is no story. If nothing's happening, if there's no problem, there is no story. So what is the conflict? It could be something is wrong. There's something wrong with the current situation. Or there could be some sort of gap in our knowledge or our information. Or it could be that we have information, but it's not exactly clear. So we need to do some clarification. Or it could be there's nothing wrong, but the author or the people who are doing the study have something to add to the current situation, which would make it even better. So of course we would want to have something better, so that is also a good thing to do. So therefore we would want to do this study. So finally, you need a protagonist in your story, and in this case, the story of your research study, you are the protagonist, or you and your team are the protagonist. You are the heroes of this story. So you're going to come in and show, finally, in your introduction, why are you doing this study? What's the purpose of this? Or what is your hypothesis that you're going to then test using the methodology that's described next? Or you may actually show the findings. So you can tell the reader, this is what we found in our study, and then you can look at the methodology of how you went about getting those results. You also could explain the value of the study. So you say, here are our findings, and this is why this is valuable to you. This is why it's important. And then if the paper is rather long, you might actually put an outline of the paper to say, to give the reader kind of a map of where you're going to be going in the paper. All right, so we're going to see each of these in different ways in some of the examples. So these are all examples that were submitted from students who are doing research, and these are articles from their literature reviews. So let's look at these real-world examples. The first one is about packaging vegetables. So this is a real-world problem. All of us have gone to the grocery store and purchased vegetables, and very often they're wrapped in plastic to protect them and preserve them. So this paper is going to look at one of the problems associated with that. All right, so first of all, it starts off with the products they're fresh fruits and vegetables, therefore they can deteriorate. They are alive. You're not just packaging a piece of metal or wood. This is something which still has a metabolism. It could deteriorate. Right? So this is a basic problem, is that fruits and vegetables do deteriorate. They don't last forever. All right? And then the next statement is, not only do they deteriorate, but they can be contaminated with bacteria, yeast, mold. All right, so we have two problems there. The vegetables are going to deteriorate themselves, they're going to rot, and they can be infected by they can be contaminated by bacteria and other things. All right, the next statement looks at the packaging. And what I would like to say here is if we're talking about protecting these vegetables, then the relationship between A and B lead to C. So I would like to say I would actually add a signal word, a signal phrase here to say, for these reasons, fresh produce needs to be packaged with films with a high oxygen and water vapor permeability. All right, so we need a barrier of some sort. We need a wrapping which is going to allow oxygen and water to pass through it. It's not going to trap it inside. And that's the next one. So the signal word here, however, shows us that, okay, as you put the plastic wrapping around it, however, this also could have a problem because these packaging sometimes have too low water vapor permeability. In other words, they don't allow the water to escape, they keep it inside, and that creates the next problem, which is you get microbial growth. So you have microbial growth because the plastic wrapping, which is there to protect it and preserve it, is actually creating an environment where you have microbial growth, which is also going to cause a problem. And not just that, but you also have decay. And also, in the next statement, we have condensation is made even worse. It's aggravated, this problem, right, is aggravated by temperature fluctuations. So all this is coming together to create quite a complex problem. Right, so what do we do about that? Here is a possible solution. We can look at these thermoplastic polyurethane packaging, and the author goes through and talks about those. And I'm going to skip down here to what is labeled G. Many of the different studies have found a relationship between the structure and the barrier properties of these polyurethanes. So here we have this packaging, but interestingly, the different structures relate to different barrier properties. In other words, different structures will have a different possible effect on how water vapor and gases pass through this barrier. So this is something we want to know about. How do we match these up and get the properties that we want? So studies have looked at this. They've looked at this in the past. This is referring back to, this is setting the background. And then we get to how do we actually measure this? Right? How do we calculate that? And I looks at, there are many different standards for this. And so many different ways we can measure this. So we're moving forward. We need the packaging. Here is a kind of packaging, and this packaging we need to understand the properties of it. We need to measure it, and there are different measurements. So before we go to the next page, just wanted to note a couple of interesting phrases here. So remember that showing how important this field is really a very important feature of the introduction. And here we have phrases like the most important, or very important, or the most important. So notice the author is repeating these words, emphasizing how important this area and these different aspects that are covered in the introduction are. All right, so we go to the next page where the author is continuing to describe the different standards that are used for measuring water vapor permeability. And there, J, we've got another signal word, however. All right, so we have measurements that we can do. However, there's a problem with this too. These measures are able to accurately characterize how the gas can pass through the polymer, except where there's a strong interaction between the polymer and Gauss molecules. In other words, in a situation like where you have water vapor, in other words, that's exactly the situation that we're dealing with the vegetables. There's water vapor in there, and you have these hydrophilic polymers around them. That's the times when these measures may not be accurate. So that's going to be a problem. So you've got measurements, but they are not always accurate. And they may show a non-ideal behavior. In other words, they won't be as predicted. Then they explain that this is because at higher relative humidity, the permeability of the polymer increases, and that's because of swelling. So that means our measurements may not be valid. They may be valid only at a specific defined relative humidity, but of course that's not going to always be true. Therefore, now we're coming down to our next solution is we need to figure out a way to accurately measure the permeability of these polyurethanes. So that would be of great interest. This is very important. All right, so now the authors are ready to introduce their study. In their study, they're going to look at improving the measurement of this water vapor permeability. And right here we get a little bit of a grammar correction here. So it's also worth mentioning that the properties such as density, microscopic polymer structures, etc., were not entirely available. So this is another gap in the knowledge they're introducing. So they're saying that we need an accurate measure, and we also didn't necessarily know all of the properties of these materials. So these are two things that we need to try to figure out, that we need to try to understand. So therefore, we come to this study they're introducing. So the end of this introduction, they're ready to tell us what it is that we're going to do. And I've rephrased it a little bit here to try to make it a little clearer. Their last sentence, unfortunately, was a little unclear in the way it was phrased. So this emphasizes a little bit why it's really important to proofread and revise and get other people to look at your paper. So they came down to the most critical part of the paper to say, all right, why do we need to do your study? And that sentence actually was not entirely clear. So if we rephrase it this way, the aim of this study is to discuss how and to what extent chemical composition and relative humidity affect water vapor barrier properties of synthesized films, and to compare the results of, and here was another grammatical error that caused a little confusion. It's either an alternative method or alternative methods with standard gravimetric method. So they're going to compare the standard gravimetric method with probably an alternative method, and they're going to try to solve this problem by investigating if you change the relative humidity and the temperature, does that affect the water vapor permeability? Looking at this paper, they do a really good job of leading us all the way from the fact that the vegetables are deteriorating, they can get contaminated. We need some sort of packaging to protect them, but that packaging itself can create a situation, an environment that itself would be a problem and allow for microbial growth. So we have to understand the packaging better to create better packaging. We have measurements, but those measurements are possibly not precise in different relative humidity or different temperatures. And so we need to do this study to try to better understand these packaging materials so that we can choose the correct ones or more efficient ones for our packaging. So that led us very nicely from the basic problem through the history of the research so far down to this present study. And now we understand why this is important, not just to these researchers, but it's important to every one of us who goes to the grocery store and wants to get vegetables that are fresh and not moldy or somehow rotting. All right, so very nice example. All right, so another one also to do with plants, but this time we're going to look at the plants while they're still in the field, while they're still growing, and try to understand them there. And so this is a study about a mini rhizotron, which is a way of studying the plant root system. So let's take a look at this one. So here in the background section, so we start off with the root system is really important. Obviously, it's the place where the water and the nutrition comes into the plant. So that's a good point that they're saying that the root system is very important. Then to really take care of the plant and to make advances in breeding the plants or feeding the plants, taking care of the plants, we need to understand the root system, the shape of it, how it's developing. And so we need to have an accurate understanding of that in real time. All right? So we need to do it as the plant is developing. We need to understand that, so that this is a prerequisite. All right? So we need to know this before we're able to do things like do genetic improvement or figure out watering or fertilization, all of these things, understanding crop yield. We need to basically understand the root system. We see here the words like principle that show us that this is very important or very important. So notice these words, most important. So they're stressing why this study is really important. All right, now there's a problem, and that is that the root system is not clearly visible due to opacity, all right, which means the root system is in the ground, and it's also complex. So you have a complex system which is in the ground, therefore it's not exactly easy to study. So research here has been rather slow in developing, because how do you study something that you cannot see or get to easily? Now there were traditional methods which are introduced in E, and these traditional methods were excavation. Excavation means to dig up. If you're going to dig them up, you're actually destroying the plants. So you might see a plant and say, okay, let's find out if this plant system's roots are developing well. You dig it up and take it out of the ground and say, oh yeah, it's working well. The problem with that is that plant is good, it was growing very nicely, but now you've killed it by taking it out of the ground. So that's not exactly ideal, where you destroy the object of your study. Or there are other options. You could grow them, for example, in a hydroponic situation, like in water, but then you're changing the situation. It's not the same growth pattern in water that you would get in soil. So you've got two problems. Either you're destroying your subject, or you are actually changing the object of your study by studying it. So neither one of those is ideal. Right? So you're not going to get universal results by studying things in this way. So coming down to the next paragraph, the authors introduce more modern methodologies. One of them is X-ray computed tomography. So that would be really good. You can X-ray the roots, then you don't have to destroy them. Or you could use radioisotope tracing, where you would put radioactive isotopes into the water, let them be absorbed into the plant, and then you could use that to create an image to see where the root system is, or nuclear magnetic resonance. All right, so these are all methodologies which are very sophisticated, which could give a nice picture of the roots. There's one other one mentioned here, and this is the mini risotron, which we're going to come back to in just a second. All right, so looking at those first three modern methods, they are all very expensive. So taking a plant into a laboratory and X-raying it, or using radioactive isotopes or nuclear magnetic resonance, these are all methodologies which you have to be in a laboratory. They're very expensive. So it's not exactly, you can't exactly go out into the cornfield and do this study. So all of these might give a better picture, but they have real drawbacks. All right, so down to I. I repeated I here because now we're coming back to that fourth method, which is the mini risotron. And this one, looking at Bates, 1937, this one is non-destructive. So it's not going to destroy the root system. And it's also not super expensive like the other three methods. There's been a lot of research in this area. And let me make two notes here. One, speaking, you could, in casual conversation or in spoken conversation, saying a lot is very, very common. However, if I were writing this paper, I would probably say something like studies in several environments, which is what they actually talk about. The authors talk about the different environments, whether it's a forest, an orchard, agro-ecosystem, and other areas. So research is not a count noun, so I would not use research in the plural, and I would also not use a lot if I were writing an academic paper. The authors are showing us that, yes, here's a method which doesn't destroy the plants, and it also has been done in many different environments. All right, we won't look at all the different details of this. However, coming down here, if you look at the next paragraph, the mini risotron, to some extent, provided a method of observing roots over a long period of time. that to some extent is showing us that it solved the problem, but not completely. So there are still some problems with this method. So we made an improvement, we're getting better, but we're still not there. So, however, shows us what those are. Many studies, we're looking at previous research, the mini-risotron disturb the roots. They were able to observe the roots without destroying them, but they actually disturb them. They're going to change. It caused excessive root proliferation. So the roots are growing more than they normally would. So again, we're changing what we're studying, and that's not ideal, because if we're changing what we're studying, our results are not accurate. This is the observer's paradox, that if you observe something, you very often change it, and so therefore your observations are not valid. They're actually inserting a clear tube into the soil so that you could then photograph the root system, so you could kind of peer in there. The problem is, as you increase the size of the tube to be able to get better access to the roots, you're creating problems. You're putting more light into the soil, which is not natural, and you're also loosening, you're affecting how compact the soil is by putting things into it and breaking the soil up. So you're, again, disturbing the root system and creating problems there. So the traditional mini-risotron was an advance, but it still created some difficulties in being accurate. Therefore, and then I'm going to rephrase this a little bit, I wasn't quite sure what the authors meant by technology emerged as required. So people have to develop technology. So I think what they mean is that therefore an improved mini-risotron technology was required, and then people actually did go about developing it, like Amato in the next paragraph developed this one, or Tsai used another method, acrylic glass. Right? So the traditional research had made some progress. However, using the cameras in there, they were measuring the root growth, and Taylor here found that there was a problem with that, that the size of the roots that they were looking at, they were actually estimating the size at smaller than the true value. You can imagine why that would be. If you're trying to look at a root through a glass tube in the dirt, it would be very easy not to see the whole root. And so therefore you might misjudge the size of the root because you couldn't see the whole root through the tube. His method that Taylor came up with improved on this and made the images they captured even more accurate. So we're getting better and better. So we went from destroying the plant by digging it up or growing it in water and not having a realistic situation, to using expensive methods, to using a mini-risotron, which itself possibly disturbed the soil and introduced light into the root system where it wasn't natural, and we ended up changing things. And then when we try to make better ones, we also need to think about how accurately we're actually seeing the roots using this mini-risotron. So we're making advance upon advanced here. Right. So I rewrote this last sentence again. This was the sentence was not very clearly written, so I rewrote it a little bit. However, there's one more problem, and that is when adapting the mini-risotron to monitor the root systems, most studies did not report what they say is biological or spatial distribution characteristics of the root system. In other words, different plants have different root shapes. The shape of the root system is different, and it has biologically somewhat different. And so if you don't report that, that's a gap in the knowledge. All right, so we get to the last paragraph here. They've done all this background to now lead up to their own study. So in this paper, they're going to explore one, the reducing the size of the mini-risotrons, so you make less of a change to the environment of the roots. And they're going to try to improve the installation validity and rationality by taking into account the biological characteristic. What kind of plant is this, and how is this root system growing? And for this, they are specifically telling us they're using the Capsicum annuum, which is a pepper. All right, so this right here, where they say this micro-risotron system was able to focus on local and micro root system changes in situ. I mean, in the situation. Fast and accurate, I would actually say quickly and accurately, or it should be adverbs. And it can be used to observe roots in multiple points. All right, so what is that they're telling us right there? All right, so that is the results. So they're actually telling us the results. They're saying they were able to do this in this study. And then in the next sentence, this will provide more detailed changes of roots in different points reliably for plant nutrition, plant physiology, and ecology. So what is that telling us? So this is actually telling us the value of this study. By having this more accurate understanding, we're going to be able to more reliably understand the roots if you are trying to study the nutrition or plant physiology or ecology. To get a look at how they structured this introduction, here's an overview, a little bit of an outline of their introductions. They went from root systems. They're really important. Of course, they're important to the plant, but they're hard to study. Right? So we need some sort of method. Well, the traditional methods were destructive, or they changed the structure of the roots. So future other methods were developed, such as the X-ray or nuclear magnetic resonance, and these were expensive and could only be done in a lab. So that's not ideal either. So we have the mini risitron, which is the traditional one. Unfortunately, had problems of the observer's paradox, that it actually disturbed what it was studying. It also had problems with accuracy, which were improved, but then one gap is that it didn't account for the plant type. So people didn't correlate their designs with particular species of plants. And that brings us to this study, which was able to quickly and accurately understand this plant and measure it at multiple points with this particular plant, the pepper plant. All right, so that really told us this story. It laid the setting and the background out very nicely for us. So now, as we read the next section, we're really ready to understand, all right, what did you do that was different? What was your methodology? And how did you get those results? So I really like the way they structured this introduction. All right, now we're going to jump to technology and economics, which is a very different field. So for this one, we're looking at Industry 4.0, and I added a little diagram here to help us understand that. So if you think of the first industrial revolution, where there was mechanization, they had water power, steam, things like that, that's the first industrial revolution. Then we moved on to things like mass production. You think of Henry Ford in Detroit making Model Ts. This is creating assembly lines, introducing electricity into the factories instead of just steam power. This is the second revolution. And then the introduction of computers and also robotics, things like that. That's the third revolution, where we can have machines that are making other machines or other products. And this paper is looking at the next revolution, which is going on now, which is where you have web-linked or digitally linked machines talking to us and talking to each other. So you have a whole network of machines communicating between themselves and with us. And this is the Industry 4.0. All right, so let's take a look at this article. So in the introduction section, they again stress the importance of the study. So the most frequently trending topics. All right, so this is a really important topic they're telling us right away. And this Industry 4.0 has the possibility of improvement. So they're not telling us that something is bad or something is unclear. They're telling us that this technology has the potential to improve situations. They can add something to the current situation, which makes it even better. Right? So we're going to unlock the full potential of this. So to be able to do this, we need to better understand Industry 4.0. However, there is a problem with Industry 4.0, and that is that it could create burdens on the manufacturing firms, either financial or environmental burdens, and it could have unintended negative consequences on sustainable development. So it's a good thing, but it could create burdens or have negative consequences. In addition, the relationship here is still under investigated. So they're identifying a gap in the knowledge that we have about Industry 4.0 and how it's implemented. Right? The next sentence here immediately refers to this study. So we've already, in just a couple of paragraphs, we're immediately hitting the author's study. And this study is going to look at the effects of this technology on sustainability performance. And they actually have their thesis here where it's saying that it needs to be realized through a well-established supply chain platform. So this was really quick. We went from this is an important topic to it has the potential to really be beneficial. However, it could create burdens and have negative consequences. And this is not yet completely investigated. And so immediately we're here to the thesis statement. All right, so after giving their thesis, they look at prior studies that looked at the role of supply chain in implementing digital technologies, and they cite several of those there. However, there is a gap here where they say few of these studies have empirically explored how digital technologies influence economic and environmental sustainability through the establishment of digital supply chain platforms. So they've looked at it, but few of them have actually empirically studied the relationship between digital technologies and the establishment of these supply chain platforms. So this is the gap in the knowledge. So what is the relationship between the digital supply chain platforms and the economic and environmental sustainability? Right. The next paragraph then takes us to another aspect of the prior research, and this is their theoretical foundation. That was one of the things that we would want to do in the introduction is tell the reader what kind of framework are we using as we're looking at this study. So in this paragraph, they describe that they're using information processing theory. They do the background to that, and then they connect that there. So therefore, based on IPT, this study examines how digital technologies are applied in supply chain relationships. So they're back to their study. Now, in addition, right, they're also going to investigate something else, which is how the other contingency factors. So when there are other things that can be happening. What is the information processing capacity of this firm that may be doing this, or how dynamic, how changeable is the economic environment that this firm is in. So after saying that, they investigate this, then they talk about it is suggested that this is referring to previous research. So they went in this paragraph from we're going to do this, and then they went back and looked at the previous research. Then they look at this study, so they look at different possibilities, and they're going to focus on environmental dynamism. All right, so finally, the last paragraph of the introduction, where it says this study, they actually do an outline of the whole paper. First, we're going to look at the link between digital technologies and sustainability performance. Second, they're going to look at the platforms, the digital supply platforms, and how that affects the situation. And then thirdly, they're going to look at contextual factors, specifically environmental dynamism. Right? And then they give an outline of the paper. Section 2, they're going to do literature review, which is interesting. They've mentioned prior research repeatedly, and now there's going to be a whole section talking about relevant research. Right? And then section 3 and section 4 and section 5 and finally section 6. This is an outline of the paper. So this introduction was quite different from the previous ones. So instead of leading in a linear fashion from this is the problem, these are the problems that have been faced in the past, and progressively how people have solved them up until now we're doing our study. This paper is taking a more circular, a little bit more, you could say, journalistic approach to introducing their paper. So the very first part of the paper, they talked about the importance of Industry 4.0, that it has potential for improvement, but has possible drawbacks. Then the next paragraph, they introduce their thesis right away, that they think that well-established supply platforms are essential for implementing Industry 4.0. but they highlight the fact there's a gap because there are few studies that have actually really empirically looked at this. Then they go back and talk about the theoretical foundation of their paper. So they look at prior research and prior work in this area of information processing theory, and then that's the one they're going to apply to the study. Then they talk about contingency factors, which is another aspect they're going to look at in this paper, and they're going to specifically look at the factor of environmental dynamism. And then they talk about the outline of the paper. They give an actual outline of the paper. So this introduction was very, very different from the previous ones. And in fact, I found this one a little bit difficult to follow because I felt like I was going between the current paper and prior research back and forth and back and forth. So it's a little bit different style. I'd be really interested to see how other people in economics or in management found this paper. I found it a lot more difficult to follow the argument of the paper in the introduction of this one than I did with some of the previous papers. So this was much longer, and it also was somewhat circuitous in that it went around several times. It kind of reminded me of a TV drama where episode after episode you might learn more about the backstory of different characters. So I felt like that was what was happening here. We got an episode, and then we got another episode, and then each time here I'll fill you in a little bit more about some more background information, another aspect of this study. So some different styles. All right, so the next thing you could do then is to think in your paper, how are you going to lead the reader into your study? You could put together an outline and think about how you're going to structure your introduction to efficiently and clearly lead your reader into what your study is going to look at. Thank you.